All right, everybody. So we're going to start by talking about the long-term and short-term causes of the French Revolution. And I just wanted to start off by just posting these two pictures. On the left, you see, if you can notice, it might be a little bit difficult, Marie Antoinette after being guillotined, and then Louis XVI after being guillotined. And I feel like, honestly, at this point, from what you guys have read and what we've discussed in class, we have a little bit of an awareness of how France got to this point. But that's really the point of this PowerPoint, is just to make sure that you guys kind of understand both the long-term causes of how we lead into this and the short-term causes. So what I want to do first is just set up the long-term problems that head France on a path towards revolution. So I would argue that it's going to have its roots not with King Louis XVI, but actually with King Louis XIV. And yeah, that's really a portrait drawn of him dressed up like he's the sun, because he looked at himself as being called the Sun King. And it's because Louis XIV believed, like it says there to the left, that he was, quote, the source of light for all of his people. So basically implying that life in France was positive, was good at his time, because Louis was their king. So France benefited because of Louis. And as you guys are familiar with in our unit on absolutism, Louis XIV was an absolute monarch, so he subscribed to the theory of the divine right of kings, insisting that his power, his authority to rule, descends directly from God. He does a really, really good job of manipulating the nobility of France. If you remember, he's the one who constructs the Palace of Versailles, and for all intents and purposes, basically makes it this playground, this amusement park for the nobility. And what that allows him to do is manipulate the situation where they are distracted by the fun time they're having at Versailles, and the gossip and the partying and all the little things that come with that, that they're not concerned about politics. And it allows Louis to consolidate his power. And along the way, Louis the 14th is going to work to expand France at his point in history, and he is going to be fighting wars during this time. He's going to have a massive army that he is going to be using throughout 4 different wars throughout this period. And so when he passes away, the situation he leaves France in is one that is characterized by the debt levels of France beginning to mount. Basically, France being surrounded to a certain extent by some political enemies, especially those in Protestant countries. Louis XIV was known for no longer allowing Protestants to freely practice their religion, so that creates problems for him with England, with the Holy Roman Empire, with Austria, with Prussia, with Protestant countries of mainland Europe. And also there's the Palace of Versailles, and you guys can see that's the picture on the bottom right there. At that time, it just becomes this symbol of absolute power, of extravagant wealth, which can be a thing that, is awe-inspiring and powerful, but it can also lead to a lot of resentment. And I pulled up this quote. I think it's a really interesting one, because, of course, Louis XIV kind of has this revelation on his deathbed, and this is what he says, is, quote, "Soon you will be king of a great kingdom. Try to remain at peace with your neighbors. I loved war too much. Do not follow me in that or in overspending. Lighten your people's burden as soon as possible, and do what I have had the misfortune not to do myself." Which is all good and great, but he's telling that to who will become Louis XV. And Louis XV, I believe, is something like 8 years old at this time, so he's not going to really be able to process and understand what's being said there. Something for you guys to consider is just, why do you think Louis was able to avoid a revolution if he was guilty of what he says in the quote? I'm not going to really go into that right now, but I think that's something that's worth thinking through. Maybe we might tackle it as a class later on. So just again, setting up long-term causes, as we've established in class, I think for this point, France's three estates definitely plays a role in the long-term causes here. So just a quick review for you. Maybe we're clear on this, maybe we're not, so let's just get it out there. The first estate is going to be the clergy, as in the officials of the Catholic Church. So your bishops, your priests, your cardinals, those who administer the functions of the church on a daily basis. And one of the things they're responsible for at this time is collecting what is called the tithes, or as you read about it in your book, the taille, or the taxes. And this is a tax that is levied on all practicing Catholics, and it amounts to 10% of your total income. Now your second estate is going to be the nobility, and these people are mostly inheriting these positions, and they are staffing the ranks in government, in the military, and in the courts. There are a few members of the third estate who come into the nobility, but for the most part, the second estate is something that you inherit. As far as everybody else in France, that's the bourgeoisie, this growing wealthy middle class, consisting of merchants and lawyers and bankers, the urban workers, the peasants, they all make up the third estate. So there's a lot of different interests represented there, and that's going to result in a lot of disagreements as the revolution takes place, because the ones who are really acting upon the revolution, the third estate, is representing a lot of different interest groups that have a lot of different priorities in their society. So we looked at this in class, but it's just worth sharing with you guys again. You can see that the third estate makes up 98% of the population, second estate 1.5%, first estate 0.5%, and then you have the third estate owning 65% of the land, the second owning 25%, and the first owning 10%, but then the third being the only ones who are being taxed. And remember, the key thing here is this tax is placed on some people who have very little money and cannot really afford to pay this tax. It has people who have a lot of money but resent the fact that people in the second estate who may have similar amounts of wealth do not have to pay a dime in taxes. And it's just this really unfair system that, again, just like we said, the third estate is complex with all its different grievances. It's going to create a lot of different grievances, ranging from I can't afford this, or I can afford this, and so can the second estate. Why are they not paying it? It just leads to a lot of grievances from a lot of different groups. So as we hit the 1780s, we talked about this a little bit. You're going to have poor harvests in France. Really harsh winters, really wet summers leads to decreased grain output, which then leads to less bread being produced. So the bakers who are producing the bread want to keep making as much money as they can with less resources, so they are going to increase the price of bread, sometimes to a very unfair degree, so much so that 80% of what peasants earn is spent on bread alone, which I really think is hard to fathom. And it's important to take a moment to even think about it. Like, we don't even spend 80% of our income on our housing or anything even remotely close to that. So just on bread is just really hard to process. And what this also leads to is less consumer goods are being produced because there's less money circulating. So even those consumer goods, the stuff that people are buying to get by on a daily basis, aside from bread, is getting more expensive. And meanwhile, the French government, in the efforts to get one back at the British for their losses in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian Wars, you guys have learned about it, they decided to support the Americans in the French Revolution, or excuse me, in the American Revolution. And we, as Americans, owe a lot to France's support in the Revolution, but it came at great cost to France because they really didn't have that money to spend, and yet they did it anyway. So the solution to all of these problems is not a good one, but to the first two estates and to the monarch, it is a simple one. Do what we've always done, raise taxes on the third estate, continue to burden them with France's financial difficulties. Now, it's a good point to just stop and catch your thoughts for a second and just ask yourself, what are 3 frustrations that the people of France might have with the situation that they find themselves in? So you guys can pause the video, just think about it to yourselves for a second, and we'll come back in a second. All right. So this is something we're going to tackle in class when we come back to this. I'm not going to really explain too much about this image because you will see it again, but it has everything to do with the problems that we've been talking about. And there's a certain way to break this down. And if you guys wanted to do this right now on your own, a good way that I would suggest that you do it is to establish what you see first. And what I mean by that is look at this as if you are an elementary school student who really has no prior knowledge of the French Revolution. And just look at it in plain terms. What exactly do you see happening in this picture? And once you've done that, then you can take your knowledge of the French Revolution and you can ask yourself, who exactly is being represented in this picture based on what I understand about the French Revolution? And what exactly are they doing in this picture? And what is the message, or what is the significance of them doing that? In other words, how does this relate to the historical moment in which it was created? And that's something, like I said, we'll tackle as a class, so you will see more of this in due time. So back to the revolution. Louis XVI and his wife are very ignorant of the fact of the matter that France is economically struggling very much. And they are continuing to live their life as they have been in the past. If you guys recall from the video, Marie Antoinette's "let them eat cake" line was not historically accurate, but I think far more telling than that not being historically true that it happened is if you recall the woman historian saying that Marie Antoinette probably didn't even have an awareness of the conditions of her people, and yet she lived about 12 or 13 miles away from Paris, which was a city going through a very difficult time at this time. So Marie Antoinette is definitely seen as an enemy of the people for those reasons, but also her Austrian heritage. That's where she was born. She's the daughter of the Empress Maria Theresa, just seen as kind of an enemy of the French nation, and yet she married the French king. And so she's got to really try to combat this negative reputation, but she doesn't really do a great job of it. And there are plenty of lies that are circulated about her, but again, there's just not enough of an effort made to correct those things, nor to live a life of moderation that maybe would not anger the French people so much. So anyway, Louis XVI, because of his poor spending and France's poor economic condition, has to deal with these problems, which now takes us to the short-term causes and effects. So in 1789, he is going to call a meeting of the Estates General. And the Estates General is a representative body of the 3 different estates in France, and this body of government has not met since the 1600s. So it's been over 100 years since they've met. And the only reason that they're meeting is because Louis and the French finance ministers are at a point where they cannot solve this situation on their own. So they call representatives from the 3 estates together to try to work out France's problems. And these representatives from the first, from the second, from the third estate are all elected by their people to represent their interests. As you guys are aware, each estate only has 1 vote. So we had talked about the problems of this as a class, and the problem with this is that it's the third estate who are really the victims here, and they only have 1 vote, whereas the first and second estates are the ones who are technically still benefiting off of this system, and they each have 1 vote. So what's going to happen is no matter what the third estate proposes, they're going to be consistently outvoted 2-1 and really can't accomplish too much. So the third estate wants a constitutional government that would make the other two estates pay taxes. And the problem with this is this harms the advantageous position that the first and second estates find themselves in, so they vote 2-1 saying no, this should not happen. So the third estate realizes that nothing is really going to be accomplished within the Estates General. So what ends up happening is the third estate says, we need to rewrite the book. We need to start all over again. This needs to change. And they're deciding that they are going to create a constitution. But there is a feeling of a conspiracy against the third estate. The third estate goes to meet in the Estates General to start drafting this new constitution, and they find themselves locked out of it. And the logic there perhaps being, if you guys don't have a place to meet, how are you going to form a national assembly and create a constitution? to which the third estate just goes next door to a tennis court, an indoor tennis court, and it's there where they make what is called the famous tennis court oath, which is super simple, an oath meaning a promise. And this promise is that they are going to keep meeting until they have a constitution drafted. So the National Assembly is kind of standing up for the rights of the third estate, because the National Assembly basically are the representatives of the third estate. And so it seems like France is starting to move towards this more progressive movement where hopefully some more rights can be established for the people. So how does this bring us to the storming of the Bastille? Well, what ends up happening is as the third estate moves into becoming the National Assembly, and as the National Assembly starts to work on this constitution, asserting the rights of the people, being the third estate, there's rumors starting to fly around Paris that all of this could be undone. And what happens is the king is sending troops into Paris. But those troops are being sent to Paris to make sure the city is stable and not chaotic and out of control. But the rumor spreads that these troops are in the city to attack the third estate, to destroy the National Assembly. So the citizens of Paris feel that it is their duty to protect themselves and to protect the National Assembly. And in order to do that, they need guns, which they have, but they don't have the gunpowder. And it's at the Bastille, this old fortress that is used as a prison at this time period in 1789. It's seen as this symbol of the king's excessive power and all the horrible unfairness that exists in France at this time. The Bastille is where gunpowder is being held. So this mob is going to storm the Bastille prison in order to get this gunpowder, and they are going to free the few prisoners that are there. I think it's like 7 prisoners or something. And they are going to execute the governor. In other words, the head of the prison, Delaunay. And they're going to cut off his head, and they're going to put it on a pike, and they're going to march it around Paris. And this kind of marks the beginning of the revolution, because it's at this time where the king has lost his control over the city of Paris, and it is the beginning of the end of his authority across all of France. It's not the end of his power. That's going to come in time. But this kind of marks where the revolution begins. So you guys do not have to worry about the short-term causes summary at all. I'm just moving ahead a slide just to kind of conclude this. So what we'll do is we'll do some practice things to kind of review some of the major things we've discussed here throughout this week. And then next week we'll take it into the actual actions of the revolution, because the Bastille really is just kicking it off. Everything we've talked about so far is really, like I said, just the long-term and short-term causes. So that's it. If you guys have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in class.